All right, so this is lesson 4.3, the Spanish-American War. In it, there will be a secret password for you to fill out on the Ed puzzle that this will become at the end, and that way I can ensure that you watched it. So first on your class pair deck, I want you to just circle how you're feeling. Let me know how you feel. Take a moment. All right, so today's learning target is analyze the events that led to American imperialism during the late 19th and early 20th centuries by examining the events connected to the territories of Hawaii, Cuba, China, and the Philippines. So what do you think about imperialism so far? What are your thoughts? Take a moment and jot those down. All right, so a quick recap. Imperialism is the policy of expanding the national territory, power, or influence of a nation beyond its current borders. Imperial powers use military force to take control of foreign territories, exerting political, social, cultural, and economic control on those territories. The United States helped overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893 and then annex the islands under President McKinley and establish a naval base at Pearl Harbor. In 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded while docked in Havana Harbor. The newspapers sensationalized the claims of Spanish brutality against Cuban people engaging in what we call yellow journalism, which is publishing misleading and often untrue stories to try to convince the American public in going to war against Spain. Important vocabulary for this lesson: yellow journalism, imperialism, the Delome letter, which was a letter written by Spanish ambassador to the United States criticizing President William McKinley and calling him weak. A blockade, which is the use of troops or ships to prevent commercial traffic from entering or leaving a city or a region. Rough Riders, which are a volunteer regiment of the U.S. cavalry led by Teddy Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War. And guerrilla, a member of a loosely organized fighting force that makes surprise attacks on enemies and the troops occupying his or her country. So let's begin by looking at some of the fallout from the explosion of the USS Maine. The United States was furious over the USS Maine disaster. On April 20th, 1898, Congress demanded that Spain give Cuba over to the U.S. Because of this, Spain rejected this order and severed diplomatic ties with the United States. So President McKinley called for a naval blockade of Cuba, meaning they were blocking the ports with Navy ships. So U.S. naval forces converged on Cuba and in the Caribbean and the Philippines, which was another Spanish possession in the Pacific Ocean. As we mentioned earlier, yellow journalism is running rampant at this time. And when the USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, yellow journalists started sensationalizing the explosion as an attack from Spain on the USS Maine. They said that Spain had deliberately attacked the U.S. ship as an act of war. More and more newspapers started to sensationalize claims of Spanish brutality, again, trying to convince the American public to support a war with Spain. On top of this, the Delome letter, written by the Spanish ambassador to the United States, written by Ambassador Enrique Dupuy Delome, criticized American President William McKinley and called him weak. And he said that he was only concerned with gaining the favor of the American people. And newspapers got a hold of this Delome letter and published that letter for the public to read. This generated public support for a war with Spain over the issue of independence for Cuba. So the question is, according to the previous 3 slides, what were the 3 causes of the Spanish-American War? Let's start by looking at the Spanish-American War. Remember those three those three reasons: the explosion of the USS Maine, the DeLome letter, and yellow journalism were the main contributing factors to the start of the Spanish-American War. So on April 25th, 1898, Congress declares war on Spain, and Americans threw themselves into rabid support of the efforts with cries of "Remember the Maine." U.S. forces began landing at Guantanamo Bay on June 10th, struggling through 100-degree heat in wool uniforms as they engaged Spanish troops on their advance towards Santiago. A major threat that came to U.S. troops came not from the Spanish, but from disease. Over 5,000 American soldiers died from yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery. They also died from botulism, which they contracted from the spoiled, substandard food in the U.S. Army provisions. They were feeding them Civil War surplus rations. What does that mean? They were feeding them leftover canned food from 1865 when this war was in 1898. So the rations were over 30 years old. One of the most famous regiments during the Spanish-American War are the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders mustered out of San Antonio and engaged in a battle against Spanish forces in Cuba. They were led by Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, who had given up his executive position in the Naval Department. This was before he became McKinley's vice president. He gave up his post in the Naval Department in order to volunteer and fight with a cavalry regiment in the Spanish-American War. He most famously led troops at the Battle of San Juan Hill, and where he led a cavalry charge up the hill and defeated the Spanish. A few years later, when Roosevelt was president, his passage of the acts like the Meat Inspection and the Pure Food and Drug Act are traced back to the tins of rotten meat that he saw soldiers forced to eat while in Cuba. The Rough Riders helped to lay siege to the city of Santiago until it fell on July 17th, 1898. And by then, the Spanish realized they could not win Cuba, and they surrendered Cuba over to the U.S. forces. The United States took control of Cuba, finally, and dominated the island society for the next 60 years. They also established a Navy base at Guantanamo Bay. But the war was not all fought in Cuba. The war was also fought on the other side of the world in the Pacific, in the Philippines. But while all the American attention was focused on Cuba because it was closer, the U.S. naval fleet was sailing to the Philippines. And on May 1st, 1898, the opening battle of the Spanish-American War took place in Manila Bay in Manila, in the city of Manila in the Philippines. American forces caught the Spanish fleet at anchor and fired on them, sinking or capturing all Spanish ships without loss of a single soldier. The Spanish never had a chance. The U.S. owed much of their decisive victory to the assistance of Filipino revolutionaries who were also using guerrilla tactics. The revolutionaries were led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who was then in control of much of the Philippines. Once more troops arrived in the Philippines in July, the Spanish surrender of Manila Bay would be negotiated. Like Cuba, the Philippines had been a Spanish colony for hundreds of years. And following the American victory over Spain in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took control over the Asian territory. The Filipinos resented this sudden show of imperialism from the United States, whose position had been that it was defending Cuba and the Philippines from imperialist Spain. The Filipinos then realized their enemy was no longer the Spanish, but the United States, and they rejected U.S. rule and started fighting against the United States, and the Philippine-American War commenced. Right. The Philippines had been, as we said, a colony of Spain for hundreds of years, and they wanted to be free. They wanted to be able to make their own choices. They wrote a constitution that was very, very similar to how the United States Constitution was written, in hopes of being recognized by the United States as a sovereign nation. Um, Also, remember at this time, right, many Americans are against this idea of imperialism because it went against our ideologies as a nation. That life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? Sovereign nations and people yearning to be free should be able to be free and govern themselves. Um, and they thought that's what the United States was doing. They thought they were freeing them, when in fact they just kicked out their old rulers and took over as the new rulers. The U.S. occupation of the Philippines was a very brutal war that the American military fought to keep control of the islands. And it's sometimes referred to as America's Forgotten War. We don't like to talk about it much. But why were the Philippines so valuable to the United States? U.S. imperial foreign policy, which are the actions towards other countries, were motivated primarily by a desire to take the natural resources of other countries. Just like imperialism in general, the goal is to take over other countries in order to extract their resources for your own use. And the Philippines were rich in resources like gold and tin and rubber and oil and timber, which were all of the resources that were driving the economic growth in the United States. The Philippines were incredibly valuable. Also, control of the Philippines gave the United States access to new markets. They're very, very close to China and Japan. And with the ideas that were instituted by Alfred Thayer Mahan, the taking over of Pacific Islands and establishing Navy bases, this just adds to that value. Control of the Philippines, as we said, gave the U.S. access to new markets. We could sell the goods produced by American factories, which many low-paid American workers were too poor to afford, and sell them to China and Japan. The conclusion of the war was very short. The Cuban campaign had lasted less than 3 months, but the fight with Filipino guerrilla groups dragged on for 3 years. The guerrillas fought from concealment in the jungles and proved to be extremely difficult to defeat. Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris on December 10th, 1898, which officially ended the Spanish-American War. Spain ceded the last territories in the New World to the United States. These included Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, Wake Island, and the Philippines. With the defeat of a major European power, the United States was now considered a world power and an empire. So reflect on today's activities for me in the Pear Deck. Tell me, what did you like? What didn't you like? What was easy? What was hard? Make sure you answer the questions on the Edpuzzle for this recording. In order to unlock the password to prove that you watched the video, you need to put it together from the slides of the Pear Deck in this order. Slide 12, slide 5, slide 9, slide 7, slide 16, slide 11. Again, that is 12, 5, 9, 7, 16, 11. The colored word in purple will give you a phrase if put in the correct order. And you will type that phrase into the last question of the Edpuzzle to give you the answer. Or the password, I should say. Alrighty, make sure that you complete Workbook 4.3, the Spanish-American War, for your activity today. Have a great day, and I'll see you all on Monday.